In the previous video, we went to the process of creating the skeleton and binding the geometry to the bones and thus creating a skinned mesh. And in this part, we are going to continue working on that by creating the IK controls for hands, actually arms and legs, and the process of painting weights, which is the process of telling the skeleton how to influence the skin mesh. Now that we have our model rigged, we want to create some controls for the IKs for the arms and legs. Now, what an IK is, see in a minute. We need to go to rigging, skeleton. You need to select rigging from the drop-down menu here and then go to skeleton and then create IK handle. Now, once we have the create IK handle tool selected, we enter the wireframe mode and then we need to create like a connection by pressing, let's create the IK for the left arm first. So we click on the left shoulder first, the bone of the left shoulder, and then the wrist of the left arm. And now you'll see this line. That's what the IK is. There's this little transform here that when you select and move with the translate tool, you get this natural bending. So you use this method whenever you want a chain of bones to move naturally by only moving one entity. So let's go to Outliner. If you don't have it docked to your custom shelf, do it. And if you don't want to, you can go to Windows, Outliner. So in the Outliner, we'll see that we now have the IK handle. I think IK stands for inverse kinematic, since that's the name of the process that takes place when you move one like last joint in a chain of joints or bones in this case relative to the root one, which as its like counterpart or whatever has an FK like method. Instead of using this inverse kinematic process, you can do the forward kinematic, or called the FK, which is basically rotating each individual bone in relation to the previous one by hand. But the IK is more useful for the natural bendings such as arms, tails, legs, etc., maybe even fingers. So once we have that in place and we see it in the outliner, we're going to call it IK arm left. We can do the same thing for the right arm. Click the create IK handle in the skeleton dropdown, select the root bone you want the IK to like come from to the wrist. Now we have the arm as well. The right arm as well. So let's name it IK arm right. So now we are going to make a useful, like a visual control of this IK to not have to go in every time to the outliner and select it in the hierarchy or in the viewport. Instead, we're going to create like a big circle around the wrist, and we are going to call that the IK control. And we're going to create that circle by going to create, going to the modeling dropdown, then create, NURBS primitives, and then circle. Now we have this circle in the hierarchy. We need to scale it and then press W, hold V for vertex snapping, and then we're going to left click, drag it to the place we want it snapped on. So in this case the joint. After that, what we want to do is rotate it to like match the position of the hand, scale it so it feels like nice and natural. And that's the right arm. We're going to call it IK arm right. Control IK arm right. Now let's select the control IK arm right. Go to freeze transformations and then edit, delete by type, history. Now we want to nest the IK arm right under the control IK arm right by middle clicking on it in the hierarchy and dragging it over. And now whenever we select the circle, we will see that the IK is selected as well. And all we have to do is move the circle around and it will influence the IK. So now it looks more clean. Let's now duplicate the circle. You can select the object and then press Ctrl D. Move it wherever. Delete the IK arm right that's nested inside it and rename this one to left. Let's check if nothing got weird here. Yeah, it's good. So we can actually return it to the main position. Snap the pivot to the by holding D and X to the center of the grid. And then we can actually type in the -1 in the X axis if that's the one you need it to be mirrored on. That's one of the ways to mirror things. There are many other ways. So let's again freeze the transformations and delete by type, history. Now it's snapped to this you can also center the pivot by going to modify and center pivot, which is useful. So now we want to nest the IK arm left under the control IK arm left. So now we have controls for the arms. You can see how powerful this can be when animating or posing. You can do that whole process for legs as well. I'll do it now, but it will be sped up so you can follow along or do it by yourself. So for legs, you want to first select the hip bone, then the ankle bone when you create the IK handle. And that's it. Now you can bend the legs as well, which will make it a lot easier to animate your legs. Now the thing that we should have done before this step is the process called weight painting. So to show you what that is, first we need to disable the IKs by selecting them and pressing enable or disable. We're going to go to disable on all of them. Also, we want to hide all of this. So now the joint movement is like if we never made the IKs and we're going to return them later. So why we did this is so I can easily stretch each of the bones and see how it influences the geometry. So weight painting is basically the amount of influence each joint has on the vertices around it. So we can see that now if I move this bone in unnatural ways, we can see that it bends this rib part here, which is not something we want, and the way we can customly influence which joint influences which vertex is the process called weight painting. This is a tedious part that most people don't really like, but it's not that hard to do. I'll show you the easiest way. So now when we have our character in its neutral pose, we want to select the root of the rig and then go right click, set preferred angle. So now whatever we do in the hierarchy with our mesh, we can always select the root and go right click, assume preferred angle, and he snaps the way he was before. So let's now make radical stretches like this. Now what you want to do is left click on the model, hold right click, and then go to paint skin weights tool. Now your model looks like this. We have this piece of interface here, which is the actual paint skin weight tool interface, and in it we have the hierarchy of the bones of the mesh that we selected. So if we select the root bone, now we can see this like gray gradient. The whiter the gradient is, more influence is happening on the vertices, and when it's black, there's no influence at all. And the values in between are like a small fall off of the influence. So the value of those whites or blacks is determined by this value slider here. If we have it set to 1 and then with the root bone selected we press on any vertex, you'll see that it paints to white. If we put it back to 0 and press on the vertex again, it will be black and everything in between. So you basically have to do this for every vertex that you want to customly influence. But the good thing is you have this big brush here, whose like radius you can influence by going to stroke and then increasing the radius value. Or more easily and more elegantly, you can hold B and then left click drag, and you see how nicely it scales. So that's the way you can influence the size of your brush. So you can influence multiple vertices at the same time. So in this case, what we want to do is fix this stretch here. We have to go through the hierarchy and see what is influencing this. Now, because we know that we moved the whole left arm, we know that we need to select our left arm first and see what's happening there. So we can see now that the clavicle is influencing it, the shoulder is influencing, and the elbow is influencing it. No, the wrist isn't, but the elbow is. So I would advise you to not paint the black values, but instead paint the white values on the joints that you want the influence to be on. So this part of geometry we probably most likely want to be influenced by some skin, some spine joint. Now the easier way, instead of going to this hierarchy here and select the joint by joint, the easier way is to right click on the bone you want and then go to select influence. That's like the fastest way you can do it. And it's kind of intuitive. Once you get into it, you'll see that it happens on its own. So we see that this here spine joint has little influence here. It's like light gray. What we want is more influence there. So now we paint that. And when we paint, we see that it like goes back to more natural pose. If you hold shift and then press left, it evens out. It like smooths out the values, which is very useful in this case. So now when you do that, you go to the arm bone again and then move it and see if it looks more natural, and it does in this case. like the extreme edge case is your arm being extended this much, and I think this is good enough. It depends on what you actually want to achieve, since it's very based on the specific model you're working on. So you just go through the joints and see what's going on which part and what influences what. So we can see that this shoulder part here is also behaving in a weird way. We probably want it to be influenced more by this here root of the collarbones. So now we can paint more influence to it. I usually set it to like 0.75 and then smooth from there. Yeah, this looks much better. Now when you move your geometry like this, you can always return it to its initial position by holding right click on it and then assume preferred angle, and it snaps to the original pose. That's why we set the angle initially. So the whole process is basically you bending geometry all around and see where it breaks. In this case, we can see that it breaks on his back. So we fix this by again going to right click on the model, paint skin weights tools, and then select the joint that we want to influence this part here. So in this case, we want the spine. And yeah, it looks much more healthy now. Again, I usually just drop one click and then smooth out what's going on there. There are various tools for smoothing which are working great, and some animators are using it. But I'm not going to go into that since it's a bit more complex. This is like the bare basics of how the whole process works. Okay, I think this is good enough. Maybe this part here is weird. Oh, this is too much. It's good to switch between modes and see, because somewhere it may break somewhere that you don't anticipate, like here for example. So it's a tedious process, but it's basically very easy to understand and get. What you want to do is bend the geometry in the way that you know it will be bent in the most extreme way, so you can see what's going on and fix accordingly. So in this case, we want this bicep to be more influenced by this here bone and not bend as much. And the same goes for this part here. So now when we bend the arm, it behaves more naturally, the way a human arm would bend, as much as the geometry allows it. In this case, when we move the leg extremely, we can see that the right leg is influencing the left leg. So let's do the extreme like this and then slowly fix these weird issues here. We know that we want the geometry here to be influenced by this joint, so we are going to paint white here. Pure white. Also, it was, if I recall, somewhere here. You see there are a lot of like small issues on toes. I'm not going to go into that since this is an example, but you would, in a general setting, want to go there and do all of those by hand slowly. That's why it's so tedious. So now when we move our leg here, we see that it's not influencing like a lot on the other parts. So if you want to paint one part explicitly, like this eye here, we can select the eye and then select the skeleton and then isolate that part. So we can now view, because we know that the eye needs to be fully influenced by this joint here, and we need to flood it with the white color. And so once you do that, basically flooding a part with white color takes away the painting information from all the other influences, because each vertex has 0 to 1 capacity to be influenced, and each joint adds the amount it needs. And then once you, in this case, fill the eye with white, only influenced by one joint, all others have no space to influence it. So let's do it for the other eye as well. So now we see that our eye is explicitly influenced by this joint here. But what we also now need is to reduce the amount of influence of that joint to all other geometry around it. In this case, it's going to be this whole bone for the face, this whole root for the face. So now if we move this joint here, it influences the whole head. We can see here the chin is being influenced by some other. So we fix that as well. So this won't happen ever, so whatever. So now when we move our eye joint, it's going to specifically influence the eye. And something here on the neck, which isn't what we want, so we also fix that. Now that we have our weights painted, let's again enable all of these IKs by going to enable. And now when we move our hand, our control, it doesn't influence some weird parts, which is what we wanted. And whenever you see something is off, you can always go back and fix it. It's an iterative process, and even if it's fully rigged and animated, you can always go back and influence those paints. So now you can pose your character or animate it in any way. Now there are a lot of various different, very complex and advanced ways to do all of this, and there are simpler ones, but I find this one to be very intuitive to understanding how the whole thing works and why everything is set up the way it is, and what is it exactly that you are doing when you're rigging and animating. So as you can see, you can now model your whole character the way you want it. Not model, but pose. And let's see how it looks without the joints and these circles. It looks great. It's awesome. So yeah, that's how you do it. This is the end of the 2-part series. I hope you learned a lot, and make sure to like and subscribe if you didn't already. Thanks for watching.